Hi folks, my name is John and this is the video lecture for Revitalization Unit 3 on revitalizing dormant languages. In this video lecture, we're going to look at a couple of case studies of attempts to revitalize languages that previously had no native speakers. We're going to look at two languages. The first one is one you are probably at least aware of, which is the case of spoken Hebrew. And the second is a language that you may not be familiar with. It's an indigenous language called Mutsun, that's native to California. Both of these languages at some point in time had no native speakers, and there's been efforts to revitalize both of those languages. So we're going to look at the case studies of both of those languages, but before we start, there's a couple of topics that you probably are already familiar with, at least a little bit, from other stuff in the class, that we want to go over again and kind of reframe for this particular discussion on revitalizing dormant languages. The first is intergenerational transmission. If you've been paying attention in this class, you probably have realized at this point that intergenerational transmission is kind of the name of the game when we're talking about language endangerment, right? It's kind of what everything ultimately is about. Intergenerational transmission can be defined as the transfer of a language from one generation to the next. And when we say that, we're almost always, unless said otherwise, we're always referring to the childhood acquisition of a first language. So like the acquiring of a child's first language in the home from their parents or other caretakers. And I say that because there are cases where languages are passed down from generation to generation, but not as first languages or mother tongues or as languages acquired as a child's first language. This is an example. In 2020, still today, there are lots of people around the world who can read and write and maybe try to speak in classical Latin, right? It's a language that's still taught in a lot of schools. People can learn it at universities. And that knowledge about how to read and write in Latin is something that has been continuously transferred from generation to generation over centuries. But that is not the kind of intergenerational transmission we're talking about, because the transfer of information about Latin is not something that happens with children. It's not people's first language. It's something that just happens in an academic context, and it has a very restricted type of usage. So that's the first part, is that intergenerational transmission is really always talking about childhood acquisition of a first language. And the second thing that we want to keep in mind is that intergenerational transmission ultimately is something that happens at an individual level. When we're like assessing the vitality of a language, we might look at the rate of intergenerational transmission, and we tend to think of it at kind of like a community level, right? Like how much intergenerational transmission is there of a language? But ultimately, it's something that we can talk about for an individual child, right? So just as an example, if you have a couple from, let's say, Vietnam, Vietnamese speakers, and they, as young adults, decide that they want to move to Canada, and they move to Canada, they're second language English speakers, and then eventually they have a kid. And they make the decision, as lots of immigrant parents do, no matter where they come from and where they immigrate to, they make the decision that it might be better for their kid to raise them in the language of the majority around them as opposed to their heritage language. And so this couple from Vietnam raises their kid as basically a monolingual English speaker and doesn't really raise them in Vietnamese, and the kid doesn't grow up speaking Vietnamese. That is a break in intergenerational transmission, right? Anytime that the language of the parents is not transmitted to their children, that's a break in intergenerational transmission. And the reason that it's relevant for language endangerment is that there is an accumulation of individual breaks in intergenerational transmission that is widespread throughout the community, right? So that couple from Vietnam that moves to Canada and raises their kid in English, that kid, when he grows up, he can pretty easily go back and become a Vietnamese speaker, an adult second language Vietnamese speaker. But, you know, there's a whole country of Vietnam with millions of Vietnamese speakers. There's lots of Vietnamese speakers all over the world. It's a language community that somebody, especially if it's their heritage language, can easily get back to if they want to, right? But if intergenerational transmission is or a break in intergenerational transmission is very common throughout a community, then eventually there is no speech community to go back to, or it's very hard to re-enter into a speech community because there's not that many people in it. And so intergenerational transmission is the way that languages continue to exist, and a break in intergenerational transmission is fundamentally the thing that leads to them becoming endangered and possibly eventually extinct. And so then language revitalization, which is a term that we throw around a lot when we talk about language endangerment, can be defined as just any attempt to reverse the effects of a community-wide decline or loss of intergenerational transmission, right? Language revitalization, so intergenerational transmission is something that we can talk about on the individual level. Language revitalization can start, and as we'll see in some of these case examples, usually starts with individuals, but the idea is that it ought to build into something that is a community-wide effort. But it is an attempt to address a loss of intergenerational transmission at a community-wide level, right? So language revitalization, that's a very broad definition, right? Any attempt to reverse any kind of decline or loss in intergenerational transmission. But what that might look like will be different in different communities based on the degree of language loss that has already occurred. So in several different things you guys have read for this course already, you've read about different ways to categorize languages based on their linguistic vitality. There's a basic kind of scale you can look at that says safe, something like here on the right, the UNESCO scale like safe, vulnerable, definitely endangered, severely endangered, and then extinct. There's no more speakers, right? And we can break down the levels a lot more than that. So this scale that's here on the screen right now is the expanded graded intergenerational disruption scale, also known as EGIDS, which is used by Ethnologue, which is one of the main language databases that keeps track of language vitality. If you look here on their scale, where you go from like quote unquote safe languages to starting to become threatened or endangered is between the 6A and 6B. And if you look at the kind of simple definitions that Ethnologue gives, the difference between that 6A safe level and that 6B not so safe anymore level is that with 6B, the language is used orally by all generations, but only some of the childbearing generation are transmitting it to their children, right? So you have there at that kind of 6B middle of the ground vitality level, you have a start of the loss of intergenerational transmission. You have some young parents who are not raising their kids in the traditional language of the community. And so if that is where a community is at, you have a little bit of a loss in intergenerational transmission. A language revitalization program, or maybe in this case, something that's better called a language maintenance program, might not be so much geared towards like creating a lot of new speakers, right? Like trying to proactively teach people the language, but instead might just be a program to try and encourage people to continue to speak their native language at home, right? If you're trying to reverse a very small, beginning to show signs of decrease in intergenerational transmission, that might be what you do to reverse that, right? You're just trying to change attitudes and say, everyone already speaks this language, let's keep on doing it. But that's not going to work so well if your language is somewhere in like this moribund category, right? So moribund languages are defined usually as languages that have only a handful or maybe a couple hundred of elderly speakers, right? The only people left who are speakers of the language are in the oldest generation, and there has not been intergenerational transmission of the language for several generations, and unless something is done, then the language will no longer exist once that oldest generation has passed away, right? But in that case, a language revitalization program is going to look very different than it would if you're in this threatened category, right? Usually, for moribund languages, one of the key strategies is to take those few native speakers that you do have left and just get them in front of little kids, right? Put them in immersion environments where the little kids can hear the native language being spoken by native speakers, and they will use their little child absorption sponge brains to soak up as much of it as they can, right? So different communities at different levels of vitality are going to have different approaches to language revitalization based on the linguistic resources that they have available to them, right? So if you look here down at the bottom of the list, these are the languages that we are talking about here today. There's two categories at the bottom of the EGID scale for different kinds of languages that have no native speakers. And there's two categories, dormant and extinct. And you may be wondering, what is the difference between 0 and 0, right? If this is some kind of scale that measures the percentage of the community that speaks the language, why is there a difference between a language with no speakers and then this language that also has no speakers? Many other scales don't make this distinction. Most linguists did not make this particular distinction until relatively recently. But the difference between on this scale, a level 9 dormant language and a truly extinct language is that a dormant language is a language that has no native speakers, but there is still a community that associates or identifies with that language that existed previously, even if there are no native speakers of it. So what that means is that the language that is dormant is associated with an ethnic group that still exists, even if the language currently is not spoken. Whereas a truly extinct language does not serve as any kind of marker of identity for any community, right? So a truly extinct language might be something like, ancient Hittite, right? Some language that was like, we know existed and was spoken thousands of years ago, but it has nobody who associates their identity, no community that associates with the existence of that language thousands of years ago. Latin is also a pretty good example of like an extinct language, right? It has no native speakers. There's lots of people that use it for various reasons, but it has no native speakers, and it's not really a language of any like ethnic group, right? Nobody ethnically identifies as like, I don't know, like a Roman, right? There's no ethnic group that identifies themselves with some association to Latin as a language, right? So that's the difference. And the reason that we distinguish between those two, even though they both have no native speakers, is that with a dormant language, there is still a possibility or a greater likelihood that the people who associate with that language that no longer has any native speakers might try to revive it. They might try to revitalize it and create new speakers in the future. Because it serves as a marker of community identity, of ethnic identity. Whereas if you have a truly extinct language, who's going to be motivated to revitalize that language, right? So that's the reason that we make this distinction, right? A dormant language is associated, has no speakers, but is associated with an existing ethnic group or some community. They associate with the language in some way, and that means that it is more likely than a truly extinct language to be revitalized at some point. So the first of the case studies that we're going to look at is Hebrew, or modern Hebrew, which is kind of the poster child for successful language revitalization. In the late 19th century, there was nobody in the world who spoke Hebrew as a first language. And today in 2020, there's over 5 million people for whom Hebrew is a first language. So that's a massive expansion. It's far better than any other language revitalization program that has ever existed, as far as we know. So we're going to look at it first because it kind of is a model by which we can sort of evaluate some other examples of language revitalization. Hebrew is an Afro-Asiatic language, which means that it is related to, closely or distantly related to a lot of different languages that are spoken across the Middle East and North Africa, also East Africa. It is specifically a Semitic language, which means that it is not so distantly related to Arabic, and also to some languages in Ethiopia, like Amharic, which is one of the majority languages in Ethiopia. It's also then distantly related to languages all over the northern kind of half of Africa here, including a lot of languages in Somalia, and the Hausa language, which is one of the big languages in Nigeria. So it has a lot of close and distant relatives. The written history of Hebrew and Hebrew speakers is one of like the oldest continuous written histories of a group of people anywhere in the world. It's over 2,500 years of written history. I'm probably selling it short. It's probably even older than that. The historical homelands of Hebrew speakers, who historically were known as Israelites and later on were known as Jews or the Jewish people. The historical homelands were in that part of the Middle East that is today the state of Israel, so right around here, if you can see on the map. But relatively early on in the recorded history of the Jewish people, there was a lot of movement out of that traditional homeland. Some of those migrations were migrations of choice. Some migrations were forced, but Jewish people have been moving outside of Israel for a very long time. And that's led to the existence of major Jewish populations all over not only the Middle East, but also in Europe and North Africa. And of course, later on, there's large Jewish populations outside of that area as well. This movement of Jewish people outside of their original homeland in Israel is known as the Jewish diaspora. And in the Jewish diaspora, you had a lot of, well, individual little shifts in different communities from the original language of Hebrew to various languages that Jewish communities spoke later on. This is a map of the Judeo-linguistic regions sometime around 1100 AD, which is well after the original movement of Jews out of Israel. Usually what happened was that Jewish communities ended up speaking kind of like an alternate dialect of the majority community that they were close to. So for example, one of the most well-known European Jewish languages is a language called Yiddish, which if you're, especially from like the East Coast of the mainland, you probably have heard of. Yiddish was the language spoken by Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, and is essentially a Germanic language, right? So the Jewish community adopted the Germanic language of their neighbors, but filled it with a lot of Hebrew vocabulary words and with some Hebrew structures, so that it became basically a unique dialect of German that was spoken in Jewish communities that were adjacent to communities of German speakers. This was similar in other parts of Europe and the Middle East. So like in Spain, the Jewish community spoke a language that was called Ladino, which is very similar to, but is not exactly the same as Spanish. Mizrahi Jews in the Middle East ended up speaking their own special dialect of Arabic, right? And all over the Jewish world in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, you had Jewish communities that were speaking something similar to their neighbors, but because they were always kind of a distinct community and in often cases were segregated and discriminated against and kind of kept separate from the rest of the communities around them, they spoke a distinct dialect of whatever language it was that they shifted to. So, like I said, by the 19th century, and really well before then, there were no Hebrew speakers for several centuries, no first language Hebrew speakers. Instead, Hebrew was passed from generation to generation strictly as a language of religious practice. It was a language that was dependent on religious belief and involvement in a religious community and religious education within those Jewish communities. Many of the best speakers of Hebrew were Orthodox Jews who actually really disliked the idea of using it outside of that religious context, right? The idea of using Hebrew in the street or in your home was kind of almost like blasphemous to a lot of Orthodox Jews because it was a sacred language, right? It was the language you used for religious purposes, and the idea of using it outside of that seemed wrong to a lot of people. If Hebrew was spoken outside of these religious contexts, usually it was for the use as a means of communication for Jews who did not have any other common language. So, for example, if you had a Yiddish speaker and a Ladino speaker, they might use their common knowledge of Hebrew to communicate, but that was about it as far as Hebrew use kind of functionally day to day. That started to change in the 19th century. Like most stories of language revitalization, the revitalization of Hebrew kind of began with a couple of highly motivated individuals. And the one that's most notable, the one whose name is often brought up when discussing the history of Hebrew revitalization, is a guy named Eliezer ben Yehuda. Ben Yehuda was born in Lithuania in 1858. He had a traditional Jewish upbringing at a yeshiva or a Jewish school, which is where he would have learned to read and write and speak in Hebrew. But he didn't have an exclusively Jewish upbringing. He went to a Russian high school. At 20, he moved to Paris, and when he moved there, he became committed to speaking only Hebrew to any Jewish person that he met, right? Assuming that they would know some Hebrew, and he was like, we're going to speak in Hebrew. He was very committed to the Hebrew language from very early on. And 3 years after he moved to Paris, he moved to Palestine, right, which is the same area that historically was the land of Israel, as part of the first wave of Jewish settlers that were moving there to reclaim their ancestral home in the land of Israel. Ben Yehuda's move to Palestine was part of a larger movement of Jewish nationalism that would eventually become known as Zionism. Zionism was a movement that developed in the late 19th century and really gained steam in the early 20th century among the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, who wanted to move back to the historic land of Israel, which at that time, like I said, was known as Palestine, and it was part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They wanted to move back to Israel and form an independent Jewish state. Jewish people all over Europe were discriminated against, and they were often violently persecuted as religious and ethnic minorities. And Zionists believed that a solution to this centuries-long persecution was for Jews to form their own independent state where they would be the majority. Zionism was also kind of an outgrowth or a response to an earlier movement that was known as Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment. The Jewish Enlightenment lasted from like the late 18th century until the rise of Zionism in the 19th century. It's kind of a parallel movement to the broader age of enlightenment in Europe and North America that you may be familiar with from like a world history course. The Jewish Enlightenment sought to improve the standing of European Jews relative to their non-Jewish neighbors. Like I said, oftentimes, or pretty much anywhere, Jewish communities were kind of segregated from the rest of the population and were often economically kind of disenfranchised. The figures of the Jewish Enlightenment wanted to improve the standing of Jews relative to their non-Jewish neighbors, and they also wanted to improve their economic integration with the broader society. At the same time, though, they wanted to maintain Jews as a distinct, separate group. And one of the ways to like meet those simultaneous goals was through language, right? Language is really critical to both of these endeavors for the intellectuals of the Jewish Enlightenment. They actually had a fairly negative views of the various Jewish dialects that were spoken across Europe, so like Yiddish or Ladino. They saw a language like Yiddish as bad on two fronts. On one hand, they saw it as just kind of like a sign of poor education in the language of the majority, right? Not too dissimilar that in the way that some people have negative views of a language like Pidgin here in Hawaii, seeing it as just kind of like bad English. Some Jewish intellectuals at the time saw Yiddish as just being kind of like a broken German, right? They thought it would be better and the sign of better education if the Jewish communities just spoke like standard high German. And at the same time, they saw Yiddish as being bad because it wasn't a pure enough language of Jewish heritage, right? Hebrew was the true sign, the true language of the Jewish people. And so Yiddish was neither good enough for their neighbors or good enough for the community itself. So instead, the leaders of the Jewish Enlightenment believed that there should be better education for Jews in the standard prestige languages, the national languages of the countries that they lived in. And they believed in the development of the Hebrew language as a secular language of Jewish identity. Secular if you don't know that word, means like not religious, right? There's religious stuff and there's secular stuff. And like I said, up until this time, up until the Jewish Enlightenment, Hebrew had been specifically kind of strictly a religious language, right? It did not have a secular life. But one of the things that the Jewish intellectuals and the Jewish Enlightenment wanted to do was to create a domain of use for the Hebrew language as a secular language that would be related to Jewish identity. So this was the first step of moving Hebrew away from being a purely sacred religious language to being an everyday secular language. But the Jewish Enlightenment figures were really, in their time, they were really concerned with the revival of Hebrew as a literary language, as a written language, not as a spoken language. So they wrote lots of secular books, poems and plays and magazines in Hebrew. They greatly expanded its vocabulary. They made lots of new words known as neologisms, which is a word you may have seen in some of the other content in this class. So for about a century, you had a consistent group of Jewish intellectuals who were seeking to revive Hebrew as a secular literary language or written language. But it's not until the late 19th century, when you had people like going back to Eliezer ben Yehuda, that you began to raise the idea that Hebrew ought not to be just a sacred language and not just a written language, but also a language of everyday communication, and that Hebrew could and should be the mother tongue of a new generation of Jews who would be born in a new state of Israel, right? These ideas were very much linked, right? The creation of a new state of Israel, the creation of a new generation of Hebrew speakers. Ben Yehuda himself did a lot of different things for Hebrew revitalization. He was a prolific lexicographer, which means that he produced a lot of different dictionaries of classical and modern Hebrew. He himself created thousands of new words in Hebrew for items or concepts that were previously unknown to previous generations of Hebrew speakers. But Ben Yehuda was not simply suggesting the use of spoken daily Hebrew, he was actively making it happen. He was, kind of by all accounts, a fairly fanatical guy about this. Is very strong-willed about raising his children strictly in Hebrew. With his first child, Itamar ben Avi, I'm probably saying that wrong, but Itamar, he was determined that his child would hear only Hebrew words and nothing else. But remember that at this time in Palestine, in the Jewish communities in Palestine, nobody else spoke Hebrew as a daily language, right? And so they only spoke the European languages that they had grown up with. So even Itamar's own mother, Devorah, did not really speak that much Hebrew, even though her husband was an adamant Hebrew revitalizationist. There's a story that may be kind of apocryphal, but it's kind of illustrative nonetheless, that Itamar, as a child, was so starved for linguistic stimuli as a young child, given that his mother was hardly allowed to talk to him since she didn't speak any Hebrew, and he wasn't allowed to play with other children for fear that he would be like contaminated by hearing Yiddish or Russian. So he was so like starved for linguistic stimuli, for hearing words, that supposedly he did not speak a word until he was like 4 years old. That's the story anyway. Eventually, however, he did end up speaking fluent Hebrew, and along with his 4 younger siblings, who followed suit and also grew up being monolingual Hebrew speakers, he was the first of a generation of first language speakers of modern Hebrew, right? So all of that intenseness, that fire that Ben Yehuda had to make this happen and raise his children monolingual Hebrew, it worked out, right? Ben Yehuda, aside from raising his Hebrew-speaking children and working tirelessly on these dictionaries, also did a huge amount of institution building. And that's really as important, if not more important. He launched a Hebrew language newspaper called Hatzvi. He taught Hebrew in the Jewish schools in Palestine, and in 1890, he created the first Hebrew Language Council, which eventually would become the Hebrew Language Academy that is still active in Israel today. So language activists like Ben Yehuda are very critical in the early stages of language revitalization. But the success of the revitalization of modern Hebrew is a lot more complicated than just the story of a highly motivated individual and his friends and his children, right? Within 10 years of Ben Yehuda moving to Jerusalem in 1881, he had only convinced only four other families to use Hebrew exclusively with their children. And another 10 years later, by 1900, there was still only about 10 families who were raising their kids exclusively in Hebrew, right? So over 20 years, with 10 families, that's not like explosive growth out of nowhere, right? Actually, the real movement began in education. In the first Jewish agricultural settlements in Palestine, community leaders began establishing elementary schools where classes were taught exclusively in Hebrew. Families were not using Hebrew in the home for the most part, right? Like I said, there was 10 families or so. But children were getting a complete education fully in the Hebrew language. In 1903, the Union of Hebrew Teachers was founded with about 60 Hebrew teachers. And so these early school efforts were not, again, like immediately explosively successful. It didn't turn the whole population into Hebrew speakers overnight, but they created a base of about a few hundred fluent modern Hebrew speakers, right? And out of this base of a few hundred speakers, created a small little society that showed that the language really could be used for day-to-day life, right? So this was, by the early 20th century, already 20 years into a project, and you had a handful, relatively speaking, a few hundred speakers, some first language speakers, some fluent second language speakers that were using the language kind of in day-to-day life. So you had a slow but consistently building community. During the second major wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine in the early 20th century, Zionism, right, this Jewish nationalism and the creation of an independent Jewish state had become much more prominent of an ideology. And the small but influential group of fluent modern Hebrew speakers were able to convince the World Zionist Congress to adopt Hebrew as its official language. In 1909, the city of Tel Aviv was established kind of as like the center of Jewish Palestine. And the entire administration of the city was carried out in Hebrew, right? So this is actually pretty relatively early on in this process of revitalization. You had an entire city that was dedicated to running its affairs in Hebrew. In 1913, the Technion, which was a school for engineers, was established, and it had a curriculum that was taught entirely in Hebrew. In 1917, near the end of the First World War, in which the Ottoman Empire was about to be taken over by the French and the British declared their support in a document called the Balfour Declaration. They declared their support for the establishment of a Jewish home country within the region of Palestine that they were about to take over from the Ottomans. And with this, there was rapidly increasing support and plausibility of the creation of the Jewish state. And in this little period from about 1915 to 1920, right, during World War I, when it looked like Palestine was about to move into British control and the British had expressed that they were in favor of a Jewish state, the publication of Hebrew language texts increased fivefold in a five-year period. So once under British control and with a strong base of first language speakers, the Hebrew project continued to expand in the 1920s and through the 1940s. You actually started to see campaigns to essentially publicly shame Jewish people, overheard speaking other languages in the streets of Tel Aviv, right? You would have like these posters that would say like, Hebrew man, speak Hebrew. You would have people actually like going around and like badgering people if they were heard in the street speaking anything other than Hebrew, which again is pretty crazy given that, less than a century previously, most good speakers of Hebrew thought it was completely insane to be speaking Hebrew out in the street. And now you had, in a relatively short time span, people doing the exact opposite, actually chastising people for not speaking Hebrew in the streets of Tel Aviv. By the time the state of Israel gained its independence from Britain in 1948, 80% of Jews that were born in the region of Palestine spoke Hebrew as their only language in daily life. Independence led to a massive influx of Jews from other parts of the world, especially Europe, and Israel developed what was known as the Ulpans, or intensive Hebrew language schools, that were used to teach immigrants basic Hebrew skills. You had a lot of young immigrants who served in the military and were required to learn Hebrew there. And as an independent state, Israel could further develop its own school system, in which even non-Jews, right, mostly the Israeli Arabs, would learn to speak Hebrew and become proficient in it as a second language. So today, like I said, in 2020, there's 5 million Israelis who speak modern Hebrew as their native language, and about 4 million who speak it as a second language. So just to recap on that one more time, you went from in 1880 not having a single fluent first language speaker of Hebrew anywhere in the world, to having 80% of the Jewish population in Palestine speaking it by 1948, when Israel gained independence from Britain. So that's, what's that, 70 years almost? And 70 years seems like a long time, but that's only a few generations, right? So within a few generations, you went from no speakers to having the vast majority of the population speaking the language in their day-to-day life, which is pretty incredible. The second language that I want to take a look at today is a language called Mutsun, which is an indigenous language of Northern California. California is actually one of the most linguistically diverse areas of native North America, both in terms of the number of individual languages, but also in terms of the number of different language families. There's actually a lot of small language families that are indigenous to California. Mutsun is specifically in a family of languages historically called the Costanoan languages, but which are also known as the Ohlone languages. Many of the languages spoken around the Bay traditionally were Ohlone languages, and speakers of these languages have been in this part of the continent for probably a very, very long time, likely several thousand years. The Mutsun territory, you can see here on your map, goes from this section of, so this is Monterey Bay right up here. This is San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay. This down here is Monterey Bay. And the Mutsun territory goes from the Monterey Bay here almost into the Central Valley of California, if you're from California or know anything about California geography. At the time of first contact with Europeans, the Mutsun lived in an area that went from, like I said, Monterey Bay almost to the Central Valley. And all Mutsun people spoke Mutsun as their first language. They were probably also likely multilingual, speaking languages of neighboring groups as well. In 1797, Father Junipero Serra oversaw the conversion and internment of Mutsun people at a Catholic mission called Mission San Juan Bautista. This is during what is known as the Mission era in California history, which lasted from about 1769 to 1833. During the mission period, Spanish Franciscan Catholics attempted to settle the indigenous people of California into mission stations and to convert them to Christianity and a Western lifestyle. The Catholics who did this kind of violently suppressed all facets of indigenous culture, including indigenous languages. And this was kind of the first step on the process of language shift in the Mutsun community, was their time at the Mission San Juan Bautista. The mission system in California collapsed in 1834, but the California gold rush began in 1849. That's just 15 years later. And Anglo-Europeans, Anglo-Americans moved in huge numbers and massacred or enslaved a majority of the remaining indigenous people in this part of California. So in that period, under kind of constant threat of violence from these new settlers and the loss of lands that they would have needed to survive in the traditional culture, the Mutsun people largely integrated into the Spanish-speaking Mexican population in California to survive. This, as you would imagine, led to the erasure of the language within a couple of generations. Language loss in California indigenous languages was really rapid, not just for Mutsun, but for all of the indigenous languages in this area. The last Mutsun speaker, a woman named Doña Ascensión Solorzano, died in 1930. She was the last native speaker of the language, and she spoke Spanish as a second language. Today, however, although originally the Mutsun population kind of integrated into the Spanish-speaking population, nowadays Mutsun people are pretty much all monolingual English speakers. The Mutsun people are acknowledged and registered with the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA. But unlike a lot of indigenous groups in the U.S., they have never been fully federally recognized as a tribe. So some of the other tribes that you might be familiar with, like the Cherokee or like the Navajo Nation, these are federally recognized tribes, and they have reservation lands. They're considered sovereign entities by the U.S. government. The Mutsun people do not have that recognition from the U.S. government, and they have no reservation lands. But the Mutsun people, who number less than 1,000, are pretty dispersed across California. There's not like a single Mutsun community. There's not like a town that is majority Mutsun or anything like that. The community is very much dispersed and interspersed throughout the surrounding population. In 1991, members of the Ama Mutsun tribal band signed a tribal constitution, and they established a tribal council. And that was only in 1991, so that's relatively recently. Since the creation of that tribal council in 1991, there's been a concentrated effort to revitalize the culture and the group identity of the Mutsun people. This is, there's a cultural element to this, there's a political element to this. There's been a new push for the federal recognition I was just talking about, as well as the creation of the Ama Mutsun Land Trust in 2005, which was a project to educate the public about cultural resources in the landscape of the Mutsun traditional territories, and to create capacity within the Mutsun community for conservation and restoration work of the local environment. So since 1991, since the founding of this tribal council, there's been a lot of different movements and creation of different organizations by the tribe to kind of restore their connection to the land and restore their political sovereignty and to restore their culture. And part of that is a push to restore the Mutsun language, which, like I said, has not had a native speaker since 1930. Despite not having any speakers for almost a century, Mutsun is actually a fairly well documented language. One of the Franciscan priests who worked at the Mission San Juan Bautista, a guy named Father Felipe Arroyo de la Cuesta, he collected something on the order of 3,000 Mutsun phrases. He cataloged them. He wrote a grammatical description. This was back in like the 1870s. Sorry, probably earlier than that, like 1820s. Yeah, he wrote a grammatical description of the language. Later on, there were Anglo-American linguists like Henry Henshaw and C. Hart Merriam, who collected word lists in the late 19th century. The most significant descriptive work that was done in the 1920s by a linguist named John Peabody Harrington, who worked with the last native speaker, Ascensión Solorzano. This is Harrington here in this picture. This is not him with Solorzano. This is actually him with a group of folks speaking the Guna language, which is a language, indigenous language down in Colombia. Harrington was an extremely prolific documenter of indigenous languages, especially in California. He worked with some of the last speakers of several different California languages. You can kind of see the type of equipment that he had to work with. I think it's kind of interesting to look at. Again, he was working in the 1920s. His work with Ascensión Solorzano, the last Mutsun speaker, generated something like 40,000, 50,000 pages of notes, just a massive amount of information. Later on in the 1970s, from Harrington's documentation, right, just his kind of sort of unorganized notes about the language, a linguist named Mark Okrand wrote a new grammatical description of the language. This was 1977. Just kind of fun fact, Mark Okrand, who wrote this grammar of Mutsun in the 1970s, based on documentation that was done in the 1920s. He was also the guy who created the Klingon language. If you know anything about Star Wars, That's actually probably what he's more famous for. Irrelevant, but fun fact. The first recorded efforts to revitalize the Mutsun language actually began sometime around 1996 with a Mutsun woman named Karina Geary. She began to work with a linguist named Natasha Warner. And Geary and a group of community language learners, including Warner, worked together to kind of take these existing field notes, these grammatical descriptions, and to extract from them language data that could be used to teach themselves the language. They worked together as a group for several years to teach themselves the language based on these existing forms of documentation. The kind of big group effort lasted several years, but eventually kind of dissipated. But there's lots of individuals that continued to study on their own. The working group that was working together for a while did produce quite a lot of learning materials. They made a short textbook. They created a dictionary that was published in 2016. They created phrase lists. They created audio CDs. They even created this kind of interesting card game that uses like a symbols as like a tool for language learning. I've kind of wanted to look more into this. But they made a lot of materials for language learning for Mutsun. Geary and Warner, who were like the center of the project, they reported around the middle of their time together that they could have conversations using Mutsun about 30% of the time, but never really fully in Mutsun, right? So these folks were taking the data that existed and trying to get as much out of it as they could. But you didn't have anybody who like was even a second language speaker of the language, right? You were simply taking information from an older documentation and trying to turn that into knowledge that you can actually use to speak the language, right? That's a very, very difficult thing to do. If you've ever tried to just teach yourself to speak a language from a textbook, I don't know, maybe you're not a linguist, maybe you haven't tried to do that. I have. It's like really, really, really hard. And this is basically the only thing that these folks have to go on, and that's what they have to work with. So they're doing the best they can with the documentation that is available. More recently, there was a dissertation from 2017 that was written by a UC Davis linguist, Lajos Shoboslai. Not totally sure I'm saying that name right. And he described kind of like a one-man piece of the revitalization project where he worked with Valentin Lopez, who is the chair of the Ama-Matsun Tribal Council, to teach and we'll work with Valentin as he was trying to learn the language. In this dissertation about Valentin Lopez learning his language, there's a lot of different like goals that were set out and kind of describe like the current state of the goals of the Mutsun language revitalization project overall. They make a distinction in their goals for the project between revitalization activities that involve immediate language use and those that will facilitate eventual language use, which I think is a good thing to distinguish between. The immediate use, for example, would be like ceremonial usage of the language, which would involve kind of like, as Valentin Lopez described it, creating Mutsun spaces. Which would be places where Mutsun was heard, and the use of the Mutsun language would kind of establish the space or an event as being distinctly part of Mutsun culture, right? This would mean like being able to give greetings at public events in Mutsun, or being able to sing Mutsun songs, and using the Mutsun language for names, either for individuals or places or animals. These are the goals that Lopez wanted to achieve in the short term, just kind of personally, right? And that's the thing. That's a good thing to realize, right? That in the language revitalization project, you have to have a starting point. You don't want to wait until you have fully fluent speakers, first language speakers, which could take generations, right, for that to actually happen. Similar to the situation with Hebrew, where for a whole century you had people just trying to use it as a secular literary language before you had people that thought about actually using it as a spoken day-to-day language. Where Mutsun is at right now is that people like Valentin Lopez just want to be able to take the data that exists and turn it into something they can use in this kind of limited way, like greetings at a meeting, to show that the language still exists and that there is such thing as a Mutsun space. Right? The more long-term goals of the current revitalization project is for council meetings to be held in Mutsun within 25 years, which is a pretty aggressive goal, relatively speaking. Being able to do, having no native speakers and basically trying to piece together the language from existing documentation, and then within 25 years being able to have like official meetings in the language. That's a big goal, and that's an aggressive timeline as well. That would require needing to teach multiple adults in the community to speak the language with a high level of fluency. That would mean the development of pedagogical materials, right? Some of those already exist, but more need to be made. And you would need language workers to work to learn the language, which is a huge time commitment as well, right? So although the Mutsun Tribal Council does have some educational goals involving the teaching of the Mutsun language and Mutsun history in schools, both at high schools and in elementary schools, they don't have their own education system, right? Like I said, there's not like a tribal reservation or anything like that. There's not a kind of condensed majority Mutsun community. So they've tried to expand these kind of educational resources into high schools and elementary schools in the area, but that's kind of a tough thing to do. And there's no like explicitly stated goal at this point that people want to have generations of children growing up speaking Mutsun as a first language. This is probably the ultimate dream of people who are working to revitalize the Mutsun language, but it's not something that is like actively planned for at this stage, right? There's a number of committed language learners who have learned basic phrases and grammar, and they've begun to use it ceremonially. Some people have begun the work of decoding the documentation for themselves. And all of this is a lot of really promising first steps in the road to revitalization. But like we saw with Hebrew, it takes a long time and it takes a lot of resources. Okay, so I wanted to conclude here with a couple of summary points to kind of maybe compare and contrast the two case studies we just looked at. And I wanted to start with a quote from one of the academic papers that I read for this presentation about the revitalization of the Mutsun language, written by Warner et al. 2009. They say, any revitalization program is faced with a unique set of circumstances which constrain the extent of the work they can undertake. What they're saying is every situation is a little bit different, and different communities are going to have different restrictions, different problems that they're going to have to overcome if they want to revitalize their language. These include the amount, type, and quality of documentation available, the number of interested learners, the geographic dispersal of the community, and funding. So I want to take this as kind of a starting point and talk about each of those things individually in terms of the case studies we've just looked at. So first, when we talk about the amount and quality of the documentation available when you're trying to revitalize a language, essentially what this is saying is in the absence of speakers of a language, in the absence of native speakers of a language, what linguistic resources do you have from which to revitalize the language? One of the things that's really, really different about Hebrew compared to pretty much any other dormant language that wants to revitalize, or any other dormant language that a community of people want to revitalize. I don't think the language can magically revitalize itself. One of the things that's so different about Hebrew is that despite the fact that there were no first language speakers of Hebrew for a very long time, you had a continuous process of transmission of the language as a second language, as a ceremonial religious language, and as a literary language for a very long time, despite the fact that there were no first language speakers. So even though you had no native speakers, you did have speakers, right? The knowledge of kind of the basics of how the language worked, even if it was in a very restricted domain, was maintained for centuries despite not having any first language speakers. So that's a type of linguistic resource that a lot of other communities do not have access to. In the case of Mutsun, you had no speakers, but you did have a degree of documentation of the language, right? So if you don't have anyone who speaks the language that can teach you, all that you have to go on for revitalizing a language is what is written down about it. So any of the vocabulary that you want to know, if it's not in the documentation, you're going to have to, you know, essentially make it up, right? You're going to have to come up with something else, and it's not going to be available to you. Whatever is not written down about the language, whatever is not documented, once there are no more speakers, it's essentially is gone. You can take good guesses, but that's what you're doing. You're never basing it on observable, documented evidence of how the language was spoken previously. The number of interested learners is a very interesting kind of metric to use. And one thing that I think is important here is when we talk about the interest level of a community in revitalizing a language that has no more speakers. The interest level that leads to a revitalization project is almost always tied to some larger project of cultural renewal and often of some kind of political renewal as well, right? So that's very evident in the case of Hebrew, right? It's pretty impossible to imagine such a success of the revitalization of Hebrew in the absence of the Zionist movement that was occurring at the same time, right? Those two things really go together historically. It's very unlikely that you would have had this revitalization of Hebrew as a spoken language if you did not also have this movement for the creation of the state of Israel, right? Which is a project of cultural renewal and a project of political renewal. In the case of Mutsun, you know, it's nowhere near as extreme as the creation of a whole new country and a massive migration project in order to do that. But there's something comparable, right? So like the revitalization of the language since the 1990s has corresponded, has grown up with a redevelopment of the political unity and kind of a cultural renewal within the Mutsun community, right? So the tribal council was created in the 1990s. They created these organizations like the Land Trust and these other like education projects. So the revitalization of the language is happening at the same time that a lot of other cultural and political projects are happening as well, right? So the interest in revitalizing the language is something that is tied to other things that are going on in the community. Another interesting piece is the geographic dispersal of the community. One of the reasons that this affects the effectiveness or the easiness of making a revitalization project happen is that if you have a community that is very dispersed, right, that affects a revitalization project in a few ways. One is it just limits the amount of time that people might have to spend together to create domains in which they can be learning and using the language, right? So one of the challenges for Mutsun is that the Mutsun people are kind of dispersed throughout a lot of different communities over a pretty big geographic area. And there's not like a single like town that's majority Mutsun where everybody lives. If there was like a majority Mutsun geographic community, like a town or a county or something like that, it would be considerably easier to just, you know, institute a Mutsun language program at one school, and you need a couple of teachers to run that program, and you can do other things in the community, and everybody can kind of access it pretty easily, right? But if you have a dispersed community, it's much harder to create those spaces, and it's also harder to just get people together to learn the language together and to use the language together, right? And you see something similar in the case of Hebrew, right? Hebrew, the Jewish population was a lot bigger than the Mutsun population is. But obviously the creation of the state of Israel, right, and this migration of Jews from Europe and other parts of the world to Israel was a geographic condensation of the population in one place, right, that made the revitalization project easier and quicker because you had everybody in the same place all together in majority Jewish communities, and they were all kind of on the same page. You didn't have, it was much easier to create spaces that were Hebrew-speaking spaces, right? The founding of the city of Tel Aviv as a Jewish city, as a Hebrew-speaking city, is the creation of a very special kind of domain that is geographically centered in one particular place, right? So geography is very important here. Finally, funding, or as I would say, political and socioeconomic factors play a big role as well, right? For one, any kind of revitalization project requires money, or at the very least, it requires economic support, right? Maybe you're in a place where you don't maybe use money, but you still have to support people who are going to commit large amounts of time to a language revitalization project, right? If you want teachers to teach the language, you have to pay them, right? If you want to create materials like language learning materials, if you want to publish books, if you want to publish magazines, anything, right? That requires some money, right? Maybe less nowadays, right? A lot of communities undergoing revitalization projects can make use of essentially free publishing on the internet to create a domain that is much cheaper than other kinds of print domains might have been historically. But nonetheless, any kind of revitalization project requires time and it requires money. And more broadly, the socioeconomic factors that lead to language loss in the first place often kind of have to be reconciled to some degree in order for the revitalization project to work out, right? If people have shifted their language for economic reasons, right, because they need to be able to get jobs and they can't economically sustain themselves in the original language of the community. If you don't have some kind of remedy for that, then it's going to be very hard to convince people to reverse the language shift that has gone on because you haven't solved the original problem that led to the language shift in the first place. And the final thing that I want to point out that is a special topic when we're talking about the revitalization of dormant languages especially, is this question of what exactly is the language that is revitalized, right? What is it that you end up speaking when you revitalize a language that has not had a native speaker for generations, or in the case of Hebrew, like hundreds and hundreds of years? Because it is not going to be the same, right? Languages are always changing, right? A language spoken in a community at one point in time is always going to be different than whatever was spoken in the same community 100 years previously, right? Languages are always in a constant state of change. And so there's, even languages that have never experienced any loss of intergenerational transmission are going to be different in one generation than they were in the previous generation. So the very fact that there's some difference is not a problem. But if you have limited documentation of a language, or the language as it is understood by a population is very different than the structure of the language that native speakers used, then the language that you end up revitalizing is going to look different than the language of your ancestors, right? So for example, with the case of Mutsun, you're never going to know what the language originally sounded like in its fullness, right? Even 40,000 pages of notes is not anywhere near enough to understand really what it's like to speak the language. It's incomparable to the judgment of a native speaker. And so whatever, if hopefully the Mutsun Language Revitalization Project proceeds and you end up one day with kids growing up speaking Mutsun in their home, which would be great. Whatever language they speak, whatever version of Mutsun they speak, it's going to be different than whatever was spoken previously. And that's because we actually just can't know everything about what was spoken previously. We can only know what was in the documentation. But that's true even in the case of Hebrew. Modern Israeli Hebrew is different in a lot of ways, especially structurally, grammatically, from like the classical Hebrew of the Torah, or even more recent like Hebrew documents. And a lot of its structures are in fact actually more like Yiddish or other European languages that the Jews of the 19th century spoke than it is to the grammar of its actual kind of genetic neighbors like Arabic, right? So modern Israeli Hebrew is affected by the fact, it's deeply affected by the fact that the people that created it and raised new generations of speakers speaking Hebrew were themselves first language speakers of languages like Yiddish or Russian or French or German or whatever other European languages there were, right? Some people will take that to mean that language revitalization of a dormant language is in a sense futile, that there's no reason to do it because you're never going to be able to speak the thing that already existed. Some people will say that, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Because as I said, for one, languages are always changing, right? No language is the same from generation to generation. Language is not a static thing. It's always a living, breathing thing. It's always changing, and that's good, right? So the fact that what you speak now is different than what your ancestors spoke, that's true of anybody, right? But especially in the case of the revitalization of a dormant language, I think what is important is that you have the language being used as a marker of identity, right? So like in the case of Mutsun, those folks are really far away from having like little children growing up using Mutsun as their first language, right? That is, again, hopefully down the line, but it's gonna take a long time. And the goals right now in that community are to be able to use the language to do things like, greet people at a meeting, to say like, thank you when you're done speaking, to go out and to be able to name plants and animals, to be able to talk about things that are culturally specific to Mutsun culture, and use the correct names. So the goal of a language revitalization project is not, or especially the revitalization of a dormant language, is not to speak the exact same thing that your ancestors spoke necessarily. It's to be able to use the language as the language of your community, right? And I think I'll leave you with that. So thank you, and yeah, thanks.